All right, we are coming up on the hour. I would like to welcome everyone and invite you, and let me admit everyone here. John, do you mind admitting people for just a moment or two?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. My name is Connie Williams, and I'm the History Room Librarian at the Petaluma Regional Library. And let's start out with just a little bit of housekeeping. Tonight's presentation is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube site, as well as the Petaluma Historical Library and Museum site. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat. I will monitor them, and at the end of John's talk, we'll have some time for him to answer them. Thank you for attending. Please make sure that your audio is muted and that your video is off. Thank you very much. As we begin, let me acknowledge that we're standing physically and virtually on the traditional land of the Coast Miwok people, with gratitude and for the care they have taken care of it through the generations. This acknowledgement is particularly relevant this evening, given we'll be exploring Petaluma's Main Street, which rests on what was originally a Coast Miwok trading route. Then, as now, that trading route was anchored by a nearby village which served as a hub for commerce, community, and celebration. The three themes of tonight's talk, which is being presented in conjunction with Your Hometown Main Street exhibit, currently on display at the Petaluma Historical Society, Historical Library and Museum, curated by collections manager Solange Rusek and running through November 27th. Please be sure to take some time to go see it. It's pretty amazing. I am so pleased to introduce our presenter tonight, John Sheehy. John is an author and a true history detective who digs beneath the legends, folklore, and myths of Petaluma to find out more about things that have been hidden from the common narrative or lost to time. But he then translates his findings into the stories that bring that history to life. As a fourth-generation Petaluman, John grew up with the hills, the town, the river, all fodder for his curiosity and historical investigations. He is the author of On a River Winding Home, Stories and Visions of the Petaluma River Watershed, with photographs by Scott Hess. Take some time to check out his fabulous blog while you're at it online at petalumahistorian.com. It's a fabulous place to visit. I am now going to turn the screen over to John and take it away, John. You're on. Be sure to put your questions in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Connie, and welcome everyone. And bear with me as we go through this Zoom presentation. Might be some wrinkles. I want to start by saying that when I was a boy of about 11 or 12, my great uncle Will Casey took me on a walk throughout downtown Petaluma. Will was born in 1878 on the family dairy ranch out in Lakeville, which he called Little Ireland because there were so many Irish out there. Oops. And he was very much a man about town in his heyday, a member of the #1 fire department, a leader of the Eagles fraternity, a sportsman, a card shark, a ladies' man, and even a bit of a bootlegger in the 20s, everything a little boy could dream of. And at the time of our walk, Will was in his late 80s and one of the town's informal historians, usually holding forth in the back room tavern of Volpe's Italian Grocery, a tradition some of us local historians have tried our best to uphold over the years. On our walk that day, we stopped at the corner of Western Avenue and Kentucky Street to gaze out upon the iron front buildings there. When I was your age, Uncle Will said to me, I stood on this corner and watched those buildings being built. Well, that bit deep. Then he pointed to the brick building at the end of the block on Petaluma Boulevard, where Central Market Restaurant currently resides. And he said, for more than 20 years, I managed a grocery in that building for a Frenchman named Achille Khan. He was one of the town's founding merchants. Well, that confused me. I'd been taught in school that Petaluma's founding fathers were a group of wealthy American capitalists, a group my good friend Skip Summer likes to refer to as Petaluma's Big Five. John McNair, Harrison Meacham, Ezekiel Denman, Isaac Wickersham, and William Hill. These are five men who arrived in Petaluma with money in the 1850s and made early investments that turned them into some of the wealthiest men in the county. They were all educated Protestants from the East Coast. I'd never heard of a founding French merchant named Achille Kahn. It made me wonder about other merchants who were among the immigrant groups that settled in early Petaluma, including the Swiss Italians from Ticino, the Germans from the Isle of Four, the Portuguese from the Azores, the Danes from Frisia, Blacks from Jamaica, Italians from Genoa, Chinese, and even my own great-grandfather, Charles Sheehy, who opened a paint store on Main Street in the 1870s after being expelled from Ireland as a Fenian revolutionary. I never thought of any of them as founders in the same way I thought of the Big Five. Now, that may have something to do with the great man theory that they taught us in school. Developed by the Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle in the 19th century, the theory asserts that great men are granted superior characteristics at birth that make them into heroes because they are able to shape history rather than be shaped by it. Hence, Carlyle said, the history of the world is but the biography of great men. Well, that certainly makes things easier for historians, as every biography has a clear beginning and end, unlike history, which is something of a messy stew once you dive into it. But then there's this contrary notion known as history from below, and it focuses on the lives of common people who create waves of small events that carry leaders along with them. Such was the case, some say, with the American Revolution, which began as a groundswell among the common folk who were revolting against taxation without representation from Britain, before great men like George Washington found themselves swept into it. Or, if I may be so bold, a group of immigrants who applied themselves with courage, persistence, hard work, and sacrifice to create new beginnings in a foreign world, and in doing so, foster a bustling Main Street for Petaluma, which is another way of saying that when it comes to making a village, it takes a village. And in that spirit, tonight I'm going to briefly showcase three immigrant communities who helped to make Petaluma's Main Street a melting pot in the 19th century. My apologies ahead of time to those communities I don't have time to delve into tonight. First, a few words about Petaluma's Main Street itself. As I mentioned, the street was laid out along a former, or as Connie mentioned, out along a former Coast Miwok trading route in 1852 by the town's founder, a failed gold miner from Missouri named George Keller. Petaluma initially prospered as a river shipping port thanks to a potato boom in the early 1850s, centered around Bloomfield, Bodega, and Sebastopol's Green Valley. The boom crashed a few years into the 1850s after an overproduction of potatoes sent prices plummeting downward. On its heels came the California wheat boom. Now, the boom was initiated by the Crimean War between Russia and Europe, which cut off wheat imports from the Ukraine to Australia and New Zealand, forcing those countries to turn to California for wheat. Now, demand for California wheat further exploded with the Civil War, which disrupted wheat exports from the American Midwest to Europe. Petaluma then became something of an international port, if you will, shipping wheat via San Francisco to Europe's main distribution center in Liverpool, England. Petaluma's Big Five each made a financial killing during the boom, investing in agriculture, land speculation, and banking. Meanwhile, millions of Europeans looking to escape political and economic turmoil in their home countries took advantage of those grain ships returning from Liverpool to gain cheap steerage to the US. Most came to Petaluma first as laborers or farmers, but a handful pulled together enough resources from their ethnic communities to become merchants in town. What follows are three of their stories. I'm going to begin with the Frenchman Achille Kahn, who my great uncle Will worked for, and it was part of the town's early Jewish merchant community. Today, Lazard is the world's leading financial advisory company. But in 1851, it consisted of a group of Jewish brothers from a region between France and Germany known as Alsace-Lorraine. They opened the Lazar Frères dry goods store in San Francisco, and their timing was perfect. The arrival of women in California following the gold rush created a need for refinements such as silks, soaps, and perfume, along with wines and olive oil, all of which Lazard Frères began exclusively importing from France. The brothers then used their early fortune to expand into banking and foreign investment, opening offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Paris. They also formed the French Benevolent Society, which assisted French Jews from Alsace-Lorraine in immigrating to California. Among them was Achille Kahn, who arrived in California in 1862 at the age of 20. To improve his English and business skills, Lazar Frères sent him out to Sebastopol to work at a dry goods that they had bankrolled, operated by 3 Jewish immigrants. The 3 men, Edward Newberg, Isaac Bernhardt, and Henry Steitz, were all from Bavaria, where Jews were barred from the normal trades and professions, and so prevented from marrying because the law required they have a respectable trade in order to wed. So rather than face endless bachelorhood, many set off to seek their fortunes abroad. They arrived in Sonoma County in the early 1850s and opened the store in Sebastopol, which was then thriving with the nearby potato boom. In 1857, the men opened a second store here in Petaluma on Main Street in the Phoenix building, where Della Fattoria Bakery currently resides. It was run by Isaac Bernhardt. And then as the wheat boom kicked into high gear in the 1860s, the 3 other partners also relocated to Petaluma, and each of them opened individual stores in the future. Newberg and Kahn opened a dry goods store in the Hinshaw building on Main Street, where Lemongrass Thai Noodle Restaurant currently resides. They shared the building with a bookstore operated by a German Jew named Philip Cohen, who was also the leader of the town's literary society at the time, and a rather colorful character. Now, whereas in Germany and France, Jews had been excluded from middle-class society largely, in America, the goal was to assimilate with their middle-class Christian counterparts. That included joining the lodges of the Masons and the Oddfellows on Main Street, 2 of the core networks of the local business community. Kahn served as a member of both fraternities for more than 50 years, and he rotated through all the cheers and was really well liked and respected, especially for his humorous addresses to the group. Henry Steitz was elected to the city council, then called the city trustees, and later became the city's public administrator. The literary fellow, Philip Kong, with the bookstore, served as secretary of the Sonoma County Agricultural Society when it began in the late 1860s. And he managed the annual county fair along with members of the Big Five. Newberg and Bernhardt served as founding directors of John McNear's Bank of Sonoma County at the corner of Main and Washington Streets, cited today's Bank of America. And they also joined the Big Five in founding the Mutual Relief Association, the city's first insurance company, which erected the Mutual Relief Building at the corner of Kentucky Street and Western Avenue in 1885. The Jewish merchants were also co-founders of the Washington Hall Association that built the Petaluma Opera House on Kentucky Street in 1870 for theater and musical performances, although I've yet to find that there was ever an opera performed there. It still stands today as the second McClay building in town. It was until recently occupied by McGuire's Pub. As the city lacked a synagogue, religious services were held in private houses with rabbis who visited from San Francisco. In 1870, the Jewish merchants established the Salem Cemetery Association, purchasing land from John McNear adjacent to his new Cypress Hills Cemetery on Magnolia Avenue. And for many years, Achille Kahn served as president of the Cemetery Association, which is today known as the B'nai Israel Cemetery. Jewish merchants also remained closely engaged in religious and social circles in San Francisco, which had the largest Jewish population in the late 19th century in the country outside of New York City. Kahn was a member of the Falsburg Society of California, a group of prominent merchants around the state who all shared the hometown of Falsburg in Alsace-Lorraine, and they were led by the chairman of Lazard Perez, Alexander Weil. In 1873, Kahn decided to open his own furniture store in Petaluma in the Phoenix building, only to see the building burn down a couple months later. He and Newberg then partnered in opening a general merchandise store out in Tamales, which was then a booming seaport competing with Petaluma, actually, for agricultural goods. And Kahn ran that store for 17 years, eventually making it his own. In 1891, he returned to Petaluma, purchasing the grocery store of A.L. Whitney on the corner of Main Street and Western Avenue. He also took over Whitney's substantial feed and grain business, which was a wholesale business, purchasing his warehouse along the river at First and C Street. He operated that location until 1903, when the building was purchased and made into the Petaluma National Bank, which until this year was occupied by the Vintage Bank Association. Kahn then moved his grocery store across the street in 1903 to the site of today's Central Market Restaurant inside the second McClay building in town, which is when my great uncle Will went to work for him as his head clerk. In 1921, after 60 years in the business, Kahn sold his grocery and warehouse to two young men looking to start their own company as Hunt and Barons. And in this photo, you see Kahn's old grain warehouse at First and C Streets, which Hunt and Barons rebranded. A year later, Kahn died and was buried in the Jewish cemetery he had stewarded for many years. Now, the story of Achille Kahn and the early Jewish merchant community is a story of immigrants who found inclusion with Americans in town. I'm now going to turn to an early merchant community that didn't. The Chinese. Sadly, there are few photos and little documentation of the Chinese merchants from this time. We do know that Petaluma's Chinatown occupied Lower Main Street between Western Avenue and D Street. This map shows Chinese dwellings and businesses extending along those 3 blocks. Now note, at the time, Main Street ended essentially right at the curve before B Street. And from there, it became 3rd Street, running all the way south of town. By the time this map was drawn up in 1885, much of the early Chinatown between Western Avenue and B Street had already been displaced by new commercial buildings. The building Kahn moved into, for example, had been built by Wickersham in the 1880s on the site of a former Chinese grocery. The majority of Chinese immigrants were single men from the Guangdong province in southern China, a region racked, like Europe at the time, by civil unrest, wars, floods, famines, and droughts. The first wave of immigrants fled the chaos for the California goldfields. Now, few Chinese women were allowed to immigrate at the time due to law as well as Chinese custom, and the majority of Chinese men as a result lingered in bachelorhood and were prevented as well from gaining citizenship in California, a privilege reserved to only white foreigners, or from owning land, or from filing mining claims, leaving them largely to mine abandoned claims up in the Sierras. Despite such restrictions, by 1870, the number of Chinese in California had grown to more than 60,000. There were roughly 500 Chinese living in 1870 in the Petaluma area. Most of them worked as railroad laborers, vineyard workers, quarry miners, river dredgers, or in building stone fences for cattle ranchers before the arrival of barbed wire in the 1880s. And you can still see this picture is of a stone fence down by Olampale, but those stone fences still reside all around the area. About 120 Chinese lived in Petaluma's Chinatown in 1870, where they operated 5 laundries, a grocery, a tobacco shop, a variety store, and a restaurant that was well known for its abalone porterhouse steaks, which sounds pretty good to me. A couple dozen Chinese worked as servants and cooks for wealthy households in town. And on Petaluma Boulevard near B Street, where an empty lot currently sits beside Rex Hardware, there was a Chinese mission school, one of 16 in the state, co-founded by Petaluma Congregationalist minister William Pond. The school instructed young Chinese men in English and Christianity, but their main purpose was to send them back to China as Christian evangelists. 2 blocks away on Petaluma Boulevard today, between C and D streets, where the theater district complex now sits, stood a Josh House, or Buddhist Taoist temple. It also served as a social gathering place for the Chinese in the setting of their annual Chinese New Year celebration, during which Chinatown was draped in red dragon flags and filled with music and fireworks and great festivities for 3 days at a time. Things began to change for the Chinese in the 1870s as Midwest wheat farmers rebounded from the Civil War, and prices for California wheat, which was known as something of a hard grain — the Europeans actually used to have to mix it with softer grains — prices dropped by 40% in just a couple of years. Farmers' woes were further compounded by a crop failure here in 1876. The following year, the full brunt of a national recession that started in 1873 finally hit California, putting thousands of farmhands and laborers out of work. A number of farms were swallowed up by the time, at that time, by so-called bonanza farms, which were operated by big capitalists like the Big Five, who could afford new technology like steam-powered threshers that allowed one man to do the work formerly done by many. The Big Five also controlled the local banks, providing credit to local farmers at an interest rate of between 12 and 20%. Now, as farmers started filing for bankruptcy in the 1870s during the recession, the banks, of course, assumed their land. In response, farmers who had started a Petaluma Grange in town a few years earlier, which was mainly a social gathering group, joined a statewide Grange cooperative to cut middlemen like the Big Five out of trading their wheat. It failed miserably. In frustration, the Grange then joined forces with a new San Francisco political group called the Working Men's Party. Made up largely of European immigrants, led by Irishmen, the Working Men's Party targeted rich oligarchs like the Big Five, accusing them of giving jobs to the Chinese because they were willing to work for lower pay. The party in Petaluma, the affiliate party in Petaluma, started then an anti-Chinese club in town, which quickly grew to more than 300 members. It was headed by a merchant on Main Street called Haskell. And that group called for a boycott of all local Chinese businesses and labor. The club targeted especially John McNair, who employed lots of Chinese laborers at his brickyard and shrimping company in Marin County. McNair pointed out to the club in a public address that the Chinese performed jobs that Americans just refused to do, certainly at the wages he was willing to pay. And in 1879, after things came to a peak, the recession receded and the anti-Chinese club dissipated. Local farmers then began shifting to dairy ranching, including my family, the Caseys down in Lakeville, as well as to growing fruit and vegetables. But antagonism toward the Chinese did not fade. And in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was adopted by Congress, prohibiting further immigration of Chinese labor. But that wasn't enough for some Petalumans. In 1885, dissatisfied that the Exclusion Act was more of a sieve than a barrier, they formed a new anti-Chinese league, calling for a boycott of Chinese businesses and labor once again. That campaign intensified in 1886, in January of that year, after the nephew of Isaac Wickersham, who's Captain Jesse Wickersham, was found murdered along with his wife on their ranch outside of Cloverdale, allegedly by their Chinese cook who had fled the scene. Now, that's an allegation that I just want to note that Santa Rosa historian Jeff Elliott has done an excellent job of disabusing. And I would encourage you to check out his website, Santa Rosa History, if you want more information on that. In Petaluma, the reaction in Petaluma was that 2,000 people rallied down Main Street in a move to drive the Chinese out of town. The city's water company at the time took the extraordinary step of also cutting off water to Chinatown. As a result, many Chinese fled to San Francisco. John McNear took advantage of their departure to erect the McNear Building on the former site of some of their so-called shanties on Lower Main Street. Now, the sudden exodus of the Chinese created a labor shortage on the farms and vineyards, as well as among the wealthy households, where there was a servant problem, as they called it, because Americans would not fill these jobs. The Chinese soon began returning to Sonoma County to meet those labor needs in even larger numbers than before the boycott. Petaluma's Chinatown remained concentrated along Petaluma Boulevard today between C and D streets until the early 1900s, when the Chinese population began to decline. And in this picture, you'll see Chinatown on the east side of Petaluma Boulevard between C and D. And at the top of this photo, you can see the X there is Walnut Park. And a block back on 4th Street, where the post office currently resides, you'll see a large Victorian mansion. That was the mansion of John McNear. So what remained of Chinatown in the early 1900s essentially was finally demolished in 1926. And now for my final look at early immigrant merchant communities, I'm going to turn to the Swiss Italians. Much as with the Jewish and Chinese immigrants, the Swiss Italians were forced to flee their native land due to wars, floods, and famines. Between 1850 and 1870, it's estimated that 20% of the male population of the Swiss Italian canton of Ticino in southern Switzerland, which borders northern Italy and is about 2/3 the size of Sonoma County, were forced to go to abroad. A number of them found their way to California, first as miners and then as dairy ranchers in the Chileno Valley, just west of Petaluma. The story is well captured in a wonderful new book by Marin historian Marilyn Geary called Miners, Milkers, and Merchants, which I highly recommend. Starting out as milkers and laborers, many of them were eventually able to purchase dairy land in West Marin with financial backing from their fellow Swiss Italians, like Charles Martin, who had anglicized his name after moving here. And after making money, he made his money originally in the mines. And then he came to Petaluma. He partnered with a Bavarian Jewish merchant in town named Isaac Cohen and his son Henry to become wholesale distributors of butter and cheese for Swiss Italian dairymen across the state. And butter and cheese were the primary dairy products because milk was not transportable because of the lack of refrigeration at the time. Now, the Swiss Italians weren't the only immigrant group drawn to the area's burgeoning dairy industry. Portuguese ranchers from the Azores also began settling in West Marin at the time. Both groups initially faced similar hostility and discrimination in the area, which Marilyn Geary nicely chronicles. Some of that had to do with their Catholic religion. The first Catholic immigrants to Petaluma were the Irish. In 1857, they constructed St. Vincent's Church on the southeast corner of Kentucky and Prospect Street. By 1876, the arrival of more Catholic immigrants necessitated the construction of a new church at Bassett and Howard Streets. By the 1920s, that also became too small for the growing congregation. And I think that second church held 600 people. And so a new church was constructed on the site, funded in great part by Swiss Italian dairy ranchers who were imposed upon by Father James Kiley. So I had the privilege of being an altar boy for later in my life. But not all the Swiss Italians went into dairy ranching. Some operated restaurants like the Swiss American restaurant at 110 Main Street, a storefront now occupied by the Seed Bank on Main Street on Petaluma Boulevard. Others went into the hotel business, including the City Hotel, which was set on the corner of Kentucky and Western Avenue and was brought here in the early 1850s from Chile by boat, and became the Continental Hotel until it burnt down in 1968, I believe. It's now the site of today's Chase Bank. While others opened shops, including Domenico Pometta, who established a boot and shoe store in 1880 on Main Street in the building currently occupied by Angela's Ice Cream. Now, Pometta's store replaced the Swiss grocery, which had been in that location since the late 1860s. And it was an important place for Swiss Italians because it served as a community hub for their community. And that's partly because the store's proprietor at the time, Pietro Bolla, installed a saloon at the back of the grocery, which Pometta continued to operate behind his shoe store. So he had a shoe store in the front, a saloon in the back, and then out along Water Street, where you can currently go and sit and eat your ice cream from Angela's, he added a bocce ball court for his saloon crowd to play. It was in Pometta's saloon that Swiss Italians gathered to converse in their native tongue or to read newspapers in their native language. The saloon also served as headquarters for planning dances, lectures, political rallies, weddings, funerals, and the Swiss Independence Day, which beginning in 1868 here in Petaluma, celebrated Switzerland's founding in 1291, with parades down Main Street, followed by feasts, concerts, and balls. Like other merchant groups, the Swiss Italians also had a passion for organizing societies, including the Sonoma Marin Swiss Club, which is still in operation, and the Swiss Benevolent Society, which, like the French Benevolent Society before it, sent money back home to relatives in Ticino, as well as sponsored new immigrants from Ticino to Petaluma. In the early days, those groups also convened at Pometta's saloon. Now, this created a culture clash between Swiss Italians and American Protestants in town, many of whom were members of groups like the Sons of Temperance and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In the late 1800s, Petaluma reportedly had 50 saloons, or one for every 60 residents. And while there were certainly hard-drinking working men bars among them, a number of them served as community centers for European immigrants like the Swiss Italians, the Irish, the Italians, and the Germans. Each group had their own designated saloons in town. Now, as the Petaluma Argus wrote about the Swiss saloon back in the 1870s, let me quote this: "It operates in a very different style than the American saloon. Patrons do not belly up to the bar, drink like a horse, and then drunkenly commiserate about the gloomy future of their country. Instead, they sit down, make themselves at home as one of the family, recognizing the saloon keeper as the father in the room. Songs, music, and lively conversation enliven the festivities. The saloon keeper's wife may join the table and enjoy a foaming lager, while children scamper about and play. Temperance in all things is the norm, not abstinence. That is the charming social life of the old world." Well, for the women of the Christian Temperance Union at the time, abstinence was the norm, as they etched into the fountain that they erected in 1891 on Main Street beneath the town clock. Now, not to diminish the problems with alcoholism at the time, but there clearly was an implicit anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic bias in some of the efforts of the American temperance movement. And that became clear in 1890 with the formation of the Anti-Saloon League, which was comprised all of men and waged a very well-funded, well-organized campaign to Americanize immigrants by shutting down one of their primary community gathering spots, the saloon. The League appealed to American voters whose greatest fear was not necessarily alcohol, but the flood of European immigrants changing the America they knew. The Anti-Saloon League ultimately succeeded in bringing about the passage of Prohibition in 1919. Now, by that time, Pometta had long retired, selling his business in 1906 to a Swiss Italian named Martin Berry, who continued operating it as a saloon until Prohibition shut him down. Pometta's son, Silvio, chose not to take over his father's business, but instead took a job with Kahn's Grocery, where he worked side by side with my great uncle Will for more than 20 years. The Pomettas lived in a house on Petaluma Boulevard, directly opposite Chinatown, circled here in red. Now, following the demolition of Chinatown in 1926, that block began to gradually convert into a commercial strip. In 1979, the Pometta House was the last remaining house in the block, and it was slated for demolition to create a parking lot for new bank building, which still exists there. It's now the Summit State Bank. Petaluma's mayor at the time, Helen Putnam, called upon Skip Summer, who had developed the shopping center of boutique shops and restaurants in the Great Petaluma Mill a few years earlier, and had also moved the Burns Farrell House to the turning basin to save it from being demolished for a Wendy's burger joint on East Washington. She called upon Skip to save the Pometta House by moving it to the turning basin. Skip placed it on the corner of First and C Streets, beside the turning basin, where Kahn's grain and feed warehouse had previously stood before he sold out to Hunt and Barron's. And today, the Pometta House resides there as a living reminder of their early melting pot of Petaluma's Main Street. And that concludes my presentation this evening. Thank you all for listening, and we welcome any questions you might have.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you so much. I only have a couple of questions in the chat, and let me go ahead and move them forward and ask them. First off, it's kind of a housekeeping one of, could you go back to the slide that has the book on it, the dairy one, so people can,
Oh,
had a couple of questions. Oh, you can hold it up. Okay.
Yeah, let me see. Hold it up and try to get it to.
Yeah, get it real close there.
I
Go,
think
going closer.
Here.
It's blurry on my end. I don't know.
It's very blurry on my end too. Sorry.
Yeah. What is the name of it?
The name is Miners, Milkers, and Merchants. Miners, Milkers, and Merchants. And the author is Marilyn Geary, Geary. Marilyn Geary, Miners, Milkers, and Merchants. It's a fascinating story about those Swiss Italians who settled here earlier. They also immigrated a lot to Australia.
Okay, excellent. Miners, milkers, and merchants. That sounds like one that we definitely need to do. Someone else asks, is there a particular building that you can think of, or are there many that we don't know about, that still has most of its bones, quote unquote, bones from its origins? Or have all of them been rebuilt or gutted at some point?
Well, you know, one that also often fascinates me is the Landmark building, which is on Lower Main Street there, and where Old Chicago is upstairs. And in particular, that building was originally on Main Street a livery stable, the Century Livery Stable, built in 1876. And named so because that was the centennial of America. But if you go upstairs and you go back to the bathrooms of Old Chicago and you walk down those halls, for me, it's like being back in 1870 still. It still has the old woodwork, and it's just got that, it feels like an old saloon kind of situation. So that's one. And I think a lot of the Landmark still, although it was on the other side of the Landmark on 4th Street, was originally a grocery. It's been carved up now, but you get more of a sense. You'll see the field stones as you walk into the Landmark building, that line one wall there. So that shows how the original livery buildings and whatnot before 1876 were constructed there, and you get a strong sense. The Great Petaluma Mill is another place that, although it's been restored it, turned into shops, you'll see the old filled stone wall that was the bailiff's warehouse from 1854 along where Wild Goat restaurant is. And when you just walk in and walk upstairs, you'll get a feel like you're back in the old mill as well. Those are two I would check out.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Another question was, what kind of, you spoke about 3 discrete groups. How much interaction was there between these groups, and how much of a sense of being separate versus being a part of a whole Petaluma community seemed to exist at the time period you're talking about?
Well, I think what interested me in this presentation was just how integrated the Jewish community became, because we know what we know of the Jewish community in Petaluma largely turns on the egg boom in the early 1900s, with a lot of Jews who fled the pogroms in East Europe and Russia and became chicken ranchers thanks to the Haas family in San Francisco, which sponsored them here. But not a lot about that early German and French Jewish community here in the 19th century. And I was just so impressed how integrated they became. I think I looked at religion a lot in my research. So I brought in the Catholicism because I think a lot of the Catholic groups, Swiss Italian, Irish, Portuguese, bonded around the Catholic religion. That was another big social center in town that went on, certainly, and a commonality for them. But I do think that there was a split, underlying split between Protestants and American Protestants and the Catholics in town. We also had, I wasn't able to go into, we had a small but vibrant Black community here, 1850s, really to the 1870s. And we had a number of Black barbers in town who had strictly a white clientele. And so they were integrated into the business community that way. And they made a lot of money, and they were able to be middlemen between the white community and their own communities in town. They set up their own church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church over on Howard Street, and they had a lot of support from the white Methodist Episcopalians as well, at least the ones who practiced at the Northern Church. The Methodist Episcopalians from the South, not so much. So there were, I think you have to also think there are a lot of political differences here, certainly with the Civil War. That split people down the middle, depending on Americans where they had settled from. Most of the Petalumans came from New England, New York, Pennsylvania. They were abolitionists, but a lot of the people on Santa Rosa Plains were from Missouri and southern states, and they were Confederate supporters. So there were, even in town, there were political splits going on. So I think that commerce is an interesting area because people do come together for that. And I was impressed in reading some of the old newspaper accounts. The Chinese restaurant that had the abalone porterhouse steak, that was a really popular place. And the Chinese grocery that sat on the corner where Khan eventually had his grocery, he ran ads in the regular newspaper. So people were shopping the Chinese grocery. So that shows me that there was a lot of interaction due to commerce going on in town. And I think that was probably the place where people came together. And as I say, had sort of a melting pot. It was financial.
I'm going to come back to the Black community. There's lots of, well, no, I'll go ahead and say now that there is a push to want to continue this series so that we can hear more about the different communities. So we'll put that kind of bee in your bonnet there to talk about women-owned businesses during the 1800s, early 1900s. Were there any women-owned businesses?
Yes, and that's one talk I'd love to give with some of my collaborators in the historian group. I think a lot of women, well, I mean, it was a problem for a woman on her own to have a business. What happened in many of these cases that women started businesses with their husbands, and a lot of merchant businesses. I ran an ad in here from the Canepas. Angela Canepa and her husband started a grocery store over on Washington Street, where the parking lot for Bank of America is today. And then her husband died, and she became a major developer in town. She developed the Herald Building, as it's called now, on Kentucky Street in Washington. She built a beautiful house across from Henry Park. She also developed the building that Volpe's sits in today. Now, the Herald Building was called the Canepa Building after her, and then Harold was a drug merchant, and once he bought it after she died, he renamed it for himself. I think that should be restored to the Canepa Building. So she wielded a lot of power as a developer, and there were other women who stepped into similar circumstances. A number of them were widows, but they took on the business and they ran it really well. So I think that would be a wonderful topic sometime. Women developers alone were fascinating in Petaluma.
I think we have the beginning of a series right now. Get ready. Speaking of Volpe's, there's a question: how does Volpe's fit into the grocery with a back bar trend?
That was a very common trend up until Prohibition. And it was Fair West Grocery had it. Certainly Volpe's had it. Most of the grocery, and they were very popular, and there were small taverns in the back. And the classic story of Volpe's, and Volpe started out by another Italian named Solari, right? Who started the Volpe's before Volpe's bought it in 1925. But, in my day, like my great uncle, Will, his brothers still worked the ranches, and they came in maybe once or twice a month on the weekend, on a Saturday, to get their groceries. And that's the classic story. And I witnessed this with my great uncle George when he was older. He had a ranch over in Shelville. My father and I drive him in, drop him off at Volpe's around noon. He'd walk in the front grocery. He'd lay down his grocery list to the clerk, and then he'd go back to the tavern in the back. And we'd come back and get him around 4:00 in the afternoon. I'd carry out the groceries, and then my father would carry Uncle George out to the truck. And then we'd take him back to his ranch and put him in bed, and I'd put the groceries away. So I think that there was just a tradition. You got to remember, Petaluma, even when I was a kid, you didn't go downtown on Saturdays because all the ranchers were in town. That's what flocked to the downtown for shopping and whatnot, and for having a beer, seeing people and socializing. And so I think these taverns were local kind of gathering places around town that offered community to people.
So just to piggyback on that, were the back store taverns secret, or did everyone know about them and everyone had?
Everyone knew about them. In Volpe, places like Volpe's continued. A lot of them continued after Prohibition when they were secret, but they were well known. And there were places, and you'll see stories in the newspapers from the time where people were trying to shut down the taverns in the residential areas, like the Fair West Grocery type tavern and whatnot. So there were people who objected to having taverns in their neighborhood in the back of a grocery, and most of these groceries sold liquor too. So they had liquor licenses,
Mm-hmm.
So that's how that Swiss store started. And that was fascinating too, that I found the liquor license that the grocery owner applied for. And then that's how he set up the saloon in town.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Was there a prostitution floor next to the old Chicago? It's a rumor.
Well, yes. So the Cosmopolitan Hotel, which was a working man's hotel, was in where that empty lot is next to McNear's right now. That was a hotel. And so the Landmark building had a stables down below, and then it had rooms upstairs and a couple businesses. And then supposedly there was a backdoor entrance from the hotel into the Landmark cribs, as they were called, where they had prostitution. But that wasn't the center of the prostitutes in the house in town. It was really down on First and Second Street on C Street, between by Kahn's Warehouse, essentially across the street, and that's where the red light district was in town at the time. And to talk about women running businesses, and let me just say this is somewhat controversial, but these were the first women true entrepreneurs in town, were the madams who ran these houses. Fanny Brown, and there was a woman before her. She was a major businesswoman in town. She was chauffeured to her house of prostitution there every day from a beautiful house up on Walnut Street. And she was married and whatnot. But to run even a brothel at that time was something that women were allowed to do, but they were really good business women at it at the same time. And that's something that's not acknowledged either. And it was sad when they shut that down, because the police knew where the business was. It was contained. And once the red light ordinance went into effect in the 1910s, women went back to the streets, and that became a real problem on many accounts. So there's a whole controversial history around that area too.
A couple more questions here. Are there any buildings in Petaluma with secret passages, or buildings that have rumors about being haunted? Something fun about them?
Well,
Yeah.
there are haunted stories. All the stories about secret passages to the Phoenix from Volpe's and stuff have been proven to be wrong. There are stories about haunted. You can talk to Tom Gaffey about haunted presences in the Phoenix Theater building. And I don't know. I don't really delve into that area of history too much. I don't think Bill Sobradis and all his Houdini seances really came to any fruition. Let's put it this way.
Okay. I understand that the various hotels in Petaluma specialized or catered to distinct groups according to profession. For example, ranchers, etc.
Yep.
Do you know more about this?
Yeah. So as I was saying, they also catered to ethnic groups. So, where the Tivoli Hotel was down by the railroad yard at the corner of Washington and Lakeville now, it was originally called the Petaluma Hotel until they built the Hotel Petaluma, and then it had to change its name. But it was an Italian restaurant and hotel. And most of these places had restaurants in the hotels. And so they drew Italians, and a lot of them were working men hotels. As I said, there were people who came in from the farms, a lot of working men on the weekends and whatnot. There were other working men who boarded at these hotels, like Cosmopolitan was largely a boarding house. And then there were fancier hotels in town as well. The American Hotel, which sat where Putnam Plaza is right on Main Street now, that had been there since the 1860s. And that always advertised itself as a first-class hotel up until around the early 1900s. So it was drawing a better clientele than just working men or ranch hands and things like that. So there definitely was that aspect. And then what changes with the Hotel Petaluma in 1924 at Kentucky and Washington is that they really start to market the Redwood Highway through Petaluma. And so they're getting all this traffic going up to the Redwoods and to the Russian River. And the Hotel Petaluma becomes a really swanky stopover for people who've got money. Like people going to the Bohemian Club and years later would stop and have drinks at the Redwood Club inside the Hotel Petaluma. So there were definitely different clienteles for all these places, just like the restaurants, different clienteles. I showed the American Swiss Hotel that was where the seed bank is today on Main Street. An interesting thing, the ad I showed there was all in Italian. That was like 1900. So they were running ads in the Petaluma paper that were in Italian. That tells you something right there.
Yeah. Wow, it really does. Okay. Well, we're running up against our time here. I can't, no one else, I have no more questions for you coming from our guests here, but I can't express enough how much great information this is. And what I am reading in the chat is we want more. So let's plan on that. I think we've got lots to talk about and lots to share.
Well, and we have some wonderful other historians in town who I'm sure will be willing to step up to the podium as well. So.
Yeah, well, I think we've got a lot of opportunity. I mean, just visitors to this presentation, absolutely. We could have some panels going and some excellent uh, uh, activities ahead of us. So,
Oh, and I would encourage everyone who hasn't been down to the Petaluma Historical Library to check out the Main Street exhibit right now.
absolutely,
It's up for another month and it's well worth seeing.
absolutely, absolutely. So with that, John, thank you so much. Thank you everyone who attended. The recording will be posted at the library's YouTube website, hopefully shortly. And then we will pass it on to the Petaluma Museum also so they can at least have a link to it so you can get to it from either site. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for
Connie.
attending. And we'll see you at the library and at the museum. Bye-bye, everybody.
Everyone.